From inside the warehouse at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, it is the MASN All Access Podcast, our draft recap podcast, which is presented by Royal Farms, Real Fresh, Real Fast. Paul Mancano, Brendan Mortensen here with you the day after the draft. Sleep has not been our friend as of late. It's been a little late night last night. We're back here in the web studio to break down the selection of Colton Cowser, number 5 overall in the MLB draft by the Baltimore Orioles. We'll talk about what he means for the Orioles going forward, what went into that decision by Mike Elias to pick him. But Brendan, a big selection. It's fair to say the importance, even though it's not number 1 or number 2 like we've seen Mike Elias make over the past 2 years, still an important pick for the Baltimore Orioles at number 5 last night.
Yeah, it's still a top 5 pick. And Mike Elias said going into the draft that he expected to get an impact player, and anything less than that would be considered a failure. So the Orioles, yes, they went presumably underslot with this number 5 overall pick, but regardless, the priority was to get a quality major league player. That's clearly what Mike Elias and company think they have in Colton Cowser.
Yeah, let's dive right on into this. Let's start talking about what Colton Cowser brings to the table. On our last podcast, we went through all of the prospects that we thought might be an option, and we firmly had Colton Cowser in that underslot category. He didn't fit into the elite prospect, grouping near the top where you had Jack Leiter, who went number 2 overall. Obviously, you had Marcelo Mayer, who went a pick before the Orioles, so, not able to get their hands on him. You had Henry Davis, who I think the Orioles, the catcher out of Louisville, were probably hoping would fall to them, but he went number 1 overall, so there was no chance. But Colton Cowser was in that underslot category for the Orioles.
And he was probably the second best college position player. He was probably the 3rd or 4th best college player outright behind Jack Leiter and Kumar Rocker. But if the Orioles wanted an established college bat, they got the second best one in the draft behind Henry Davis, who went number 1 overall to the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Yeah. Were you you predicted that Henry Davis number 1 overall pick?
I did, and I feel vindicated about that.
Do you?
I mean, the Pirates were either going to go with Mayer or Henry Davis. Most people thought it was Mayer. It was pretty much just up to, I think, which guy they could strike a better deal with, I would assume. And I think Davis probably comes out on top there because most people were assuming that Davis would either go number 4 or number 5. So maybe at number 1, the Pirates were able to get better value with that first pick with Davis than they would have with Mayer.
Also a college bat. And
right.
Mike Elias talked about after the draft last night, the fact that these college bats are coveted, I would say, and the draft models that they use often show that those college performers are maybe undervalued, and people tend to go for the higher upside, but younger high schoolers. But you can find a lot of value in those college players. In terms of who was on the board when the Orioles made their pick, so Davis was off the board. The Detroit Tigers took Jackson Jobe, number 3 overall, so they went with an underslot high school pitcher. So you had Davis being gone, you had Mayer being gone, you had Leiter being gone, you had Joe being gone. So left on the board for the Orioles at number 5. I think the most obvious high upside play left for them, if they wanted to take that swing, was to go for Jordan Lawler, who went a pick later to the Arizona Diamondbacks. So 2 very different prospects here in Colton Cowser and Jordan Lawler, and the path diverged, and they went with Colton Cowser.
Yeah, Jordan Lawler has a really, really high ceiling. I think he's a very good shortstop prospect. He also had a pretty strong commitment to Vanderbilt, so it might have taken a pretty large signing bonus to get Jordan Lawler to stray from that commitment to Vandy. Usually a top 5 pick, if you're drafting them in the top 5, there's a pretty good chance they are going to sign with your team. I don't think there's a large % chance that Jordan Lawler ends up going to play at Vanderbilt, but there is still some risk there. So if the Orioles picked Jordan Lawler with that number 5 overall pick, there's, of course, the small chance that he does honor that commitment and go to Vanderbilt. But he was a very high upside prospect, and I think people were a little bit surprised, justifiably so, that the Orioles didn't look in that direction with that 5th overall pick. And then there was also Khalil Watson, who was one spot behind Lawler in the prospect rankings according to MLB Pipeline, he fell all the way to 16. So maybe, I don't know, the people who were doing the mock drafts and things like that maybe just did not have the information that the teams had. It seems like it was not just the Orioles that were not convinced by Khalil Watson.
I think that just looking at that, because there was talk before the draft that he could be an underslot pick for 1.
Yeah.
At number 1 to the Pittsburgh Pirates, and he falls all the way down to 15. To me, that says his agent maybe upped their demands.
Could be.
And the reason that he started falling was because he was then asking for a little bit too much money.
And he's an interesting prospect to begin with. I mean, he's only 5'9", and he's a shortstop. So if you're looking at the kind of prototypical shortstop in the major leagues right now, you're looking at more of the Carlos Correa build, where he's 6'2" and hyper athletic and can do everything on the field. Khalil Watson more than likely is going to shift over to second base, I would assume. I don't think there's a single shortstop in the league that's 5'9". When you think of the shorter guys playing that position, you think of like Francisco Lindor, who's 5'11".
Yeah.
I don't think there's anybody that height playing shortstop in the major leagues. So maybe teams just didn't think he would translate to that position. And then all of a sudden, if you're not a shortstop, your value kind of plummets.
Yeah, we saw Brady House, who was another high school shortstop, fall out of the top 10 and go number 11. Guy who many considered was maybe a top 5 talent in this draft.
Yeah, he's shortstop in air quotes, though.
Right. He's another guy who might shift off of shortstop because they think that he's probably going to be a third baseman long term.
Yeah, he's 6'4", and he's not the most quick athletic guy in the world. He's more than likely a third baseman.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Orioles went and got Colton Cowser with this underslot pick. And when we say underslot, let's recap really quickly. We've done it a million times in this podcast, exactly what that means and why the underslot is an attractive option for teams.
Yeah, there's a misconception that underslotting is a cheap move because on its surface, it looks like you're not spending as much money with that number 5 overall pick on a guy like Colton Cowser as you would have if you had drafted, say, Kumar Rocker or Jordan Lawler. But it's not like you get to just pocket that money if you draft Colton Cowser rather than one of those other guys. You take the money that you didn't spend on a top prospect with that number 5 overall pick, and instead you decide to use it later on in the draft. We saw it last year when the Orioles drafted Heston Kjerstad 2nd overall. They elected to use that money later on in the draft to get somebody like Kobe Mayo, who is now their 14th ranked prospect in their top 30, where if they had drafted somebody in Mayo's range that was closer to where they probably should have gone in that round, they're probably somewhere in the late 20s in the Orioles prospect rankings. So you're able to get better value in the later rounds while sacrificing a little bit of talent at the top of the draft.
Yeah, and it is a little bit of a guessing game because you have an idea of how much these guys are going to sign for when you draft them and when your scouts are evaluating them, but you don't have the exact dollar amount. So there is a little bit of a estimation, and basically what you're trying to do is you're trying to not kick the can down the road, but kick the can to later rounds of the draft.
Right.
And just open yourself up to more possibilities. So the Orioles will spend all of their $11,800,000 that they have in their coffers to be able to spend on draft prospects. It's just where that money goes.
Yeah, and Jeff on Facebook asking, why would an agent take an underslot deal? Well, you're getting drafted number 5 overall if you're taking an underslot deal. So it's probably the same amount of money that you would get if you were drafted, say, number 10 overall. You're just getting it at a different spot in the draft.
Right.
So the player is probably getting the same amount of money from their signing bonus. It's just where exactly they go in the draft.
Yeah, it's the agent and player don't have all that much leverage. So the idea that they can, if a team is evaluating them for number 5 overall, where they're the 10th best prospect in that draft, it's not only, but a large part of it is the money. So if the agent starts upping that, demand and saying we want a higher pick, hire more money, they're like, well, you're not going to get that anyway, because then you're going to fall to 10 or 15, and a team's not going to give you that anyway. So they say, all right, well, we'll take this sum of money, but we would rather go 5 than we would 10.
And speaking of pick number 10, Paul, let's talk for a minute about Kumar Rocker, because we are getting a lot of comments on Facebook saying pitching.
Where was he on your Royal Farms big board, Brandon?
On my Royal Farms big board, he was the 6th ranked prospect. But as I mentioned, he had a bunch of issues that came up during his junior year pitching. He was not as dominant as most people thought he would be. He had some issues with command. His velocity on his fastball was a little all over the place. He probably just didn't check as many boxes as the Orioles would have liked if you're going to draft a pitcher with that number 5 overall pick. He ends up sliding to number 10 to the New York Mets, where they probably have to pay him like a top 5 pick, because we're assuming that that's what Kumar Rocker's agent was demanding.
Yeah, and it's not like Mike Elias isn't aware that a lot of the top pitchers in baseball come from the first round. I mean, he said it before that if you look at a lot of the aces around baseball, most of them are first-round picks, and a lot of them are high first-round picks. But you do have to, at some point, take position players when, look back to 2018, 2019, they had Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall, back-to-back picks. Both those guys are highly touted around baseball as top prospects. You still are probably going to get a top 5 pick next year. You can take a pitcher then. Just because you have a need on the current day roster does not mean that that will be a need 3 or 4 years down the line when these guys debut and when they make an actual impact, not just when they're rookies, when they are actually contributing to a winning team. So maybe the Orioles have a pitching problem then, and they can address it in free agency or trades. But for right now, they shouldn't be looking at this current roster and saying, we need somebody to replace Matt Harvey in the rotation. Go take Kumar Rocker. That's not how it works.
Right. And Mike Elias said heading into the draft that because the previous regime drafted so many pitchers, he had a little bit more flexibility to take position players at the top of the draft. And that's exactly it, Paul. The current major league team, yes, needs pitching. The minor leagues is absolutely stacked with pitching. And when you are looking at the farm system, that's not really the need right now.
Yeah.
You've drafted guys like Grayson Rodriguez and DL Hall, and you've also got a bunch of guys in trades that have performed really well in Kyle Bradish and Kevin Smith. The pitching in the minor leagues is the strength of the Orioles farm system at this point. You need to bolster the position players in the farm system
and
now.
That may flip. You know, maybe in a year's time we're saying, all right, it's getting a little position player heavy, and then we start talking about, all right, maybe you take a pitcher, or maybe you draft a few more pitchers in it. Also considering this is just round 1 of a 20-round draft. They could go with 19 pitchers over the next 19 rounds. They probably won't, but the idea is they could take a ton of swings on pitchers over the next day and a half. Rounds 2 through 10 start at 1 o'clock today, and then you have the draft wrap up tomorrow. So just because they didn't take the one with their very first pick in this draft doesn't mean that they're not going to take a bunch over the coming days. But yeah, you mentioned it, Brendan. You have Grayson Rodriguez, DL Hall, Mike Baumann is the 7th-ranked prospect. Dean Kramer's technically graduated from their system, but he's still highly rated. You have Kevin Smith that you mentioned. They got in a trade last year with the Mets. He's already been promoted to AAA. You have Kyle Bradish, who's already been promoted to AAA. You have Alexander Wells. You have Zach Lowther. So there is no shortage for right now in the system of pitching.
And even Garrett Stallings, who they got in a trade from the Angels. He's, the 26th ranked prospect in the Orioles system, and that's a proven college arm. So they have a ton of really good pitching in the minors right now, and they needed help position player-wise, and they get a really good one in Colton Cowser.
Yeah. All right, let's start talking about Colton Cowser and what he brings to the table. 21 years old from Sam Houston State, the Bearcats with a K, Brendan.
Yeah, they spell it weird.
They do spell it weird. Overall, the way that I like to think of Colton Cowser, and when we were doing our draft prep, I like to say that he is the best of both worlds between Heston Kjerstad and Hudson Haskin, because you have the alliteration, H.H. Hudson Haskin, Colton Cowser, C.C. You have...
That's the important part.
The lefty bat, which you borrow from Heston Kjerstad. You have the speed, which you got from Hudson Haskin. So he is the perfect combination of these two, but he does bring to the table a lot of different skills. Mike Elias described him as a 5-tool prospect, and honestly, he fits that bill for the most part. The question is, is the combination of those 5 tools going to be good enough, for it to come together? And that's the hope, and but that's what they're looking at him and seeing. It doesn't always work out. Yusniel Diaz is a 5-tool prospect where he has not been able to put it all together just yet. But Cowser has all 5 of those at least on the surface level coming out of college. He has the speed. He has a little bit of pop in his bat with those 16 homers. He hit .374. He's got an advanced 60 hit tool. So that is very good. Only a few players have that in the draft. And then he won Defensive Player of the Year in center field in the Southland Conference. So he has, on paper, all 5 tools, Brendan.
Yeah, and pretty much everything you'll read on Colton Cowser will tell you that he is a high probability major leaguer.
Right.
Because he has all of the tools, and if they project throughout the minor leagues, he has a really good chance of making an impact on this Orioles roster. Like you said.
High floor.
High floor. He maybe doesn't have the highest ceiling out of the guys that the Orioles could have taken with that number 5 overall pick. He probably doesn't have the ceiling of a Jordan Lawler or Cleo Watson, but you can make a case that he has a higher % chance of making the major leagues. He's an established college bat, and if that's what you're looking for as the Baltimore Orioles, he is the best college bat that was available at number 5. If you wanted a college bat, he's the best one you could have taken.
Yeah, and I think this also shows if Henry Davis were on the board, that probably would have been the Orioles' pick.
Absolutely.
Even though he is a catcher, I think they probably would have taken him and said, we'll figure out his position later, whether he moves to the outfield or third base or wherever or stays behind the plate, because that's how much we've seen Mike Elias like and find affinity to these college bats. We saw last year, the first 3 picks by the Baltimore Orioles were Heston Kjerstad, Hudson Haskin, Jordan Westberg, in a different order than that. But those 3 guys, all 3 of them were college bats, and 2 of them were outfielders. So this is the kind of way that we've seen Mike Elias go, the draft strategy that he has employed with the Orioles over the past few years.
Yeah, and the pro comparisons for Colton Cowser aren't the most exciting things in the world. He gets compared to guys like Brandon Nimmo and Bradley Zimmer. Brandon Nimmo right now is hitting .315 and only has 1 home run on the year. Colton Cowser has more power than that. Most scouts think he'll probably be a 20-plus home run guy. He probably won't hit 30 or 40, but he has a decent amount of power. And he's a good, speedy outfielder, and most scouts think he can stick in center field.
And also the comparisons. I mean, it's just scouts saying we see shades of this guy.
Right.
It's not saying this guy is on the path to become this Brandon Nimmo. It is just we see shades of this guy. He could be better. He could not make the major leagues in theory and not be as good as Brandon Nimmo. So there's a wide range of outcomes here. All they're saying is, whether we see something of Brandon Nimmo in Colton Cowser.
And he is solid enough defensively where I don't know if he is going to stick in center field. Most scouts have said that he has enough speed to potentially do that. He doesn't have a fantastic arm, but he does have good reactions in center. So he can probably play there in a pinch if you need him to. I think he most likely projects as a corner outfield. But it's a little weird because most corner outfielders you would think of as like power hitters, but he's not really a power hitter. He's more of an average guy. So I don't know. He kind of floats around in the outfield, which is good flexibility to have.
And Mike Elias yesterday after the draft hopped on with the media, talked a little bit about the elite contact power and the 60 grade hit tool for Colton Cowser with the media.
Cowser's a guy that we were very, very high on, especially as the spring got going and the surge in power that he was showing and the consistency at the plate. I think one thing that's just really rare with him, especially in today's game, is the hit for average tool and the power without striking out. He's an elite contact hitter. He uses the whole field. And like I said, he runs and throws and plays center field and plays it well. And he's just really able to do it all. And those type of profiles are hard to find, especially with the certainty that an elite college performer provides. So, that's why he was viewed by the industry as the top of the first round talent, and we pounced on him.
So that's a major difference right there between Heston Kjerstad and Colton Cowser, because the hit tool last year for Heston Kjerstad was not nearly as high. The power was definitely higher, and scouts all agreed that Heston Kjerstad could become an elite power hitter at the major leagues. But the question was he going to make consistent contact? We saw a small sample size last year in the shortened 2020 season at Arkansas with Heston Kjerstad. He hit like 370. Or no, he hit over 400, I think, in those like 16 games before the season got shut down last year. But there were still some concerns over the hit tool, the contact from Heston Kjerstad. That's not at all a concern for Colton Cowser.
Yeah, Colton Cowser was probably the second best college hitter in this draft period. Heston Kjerstad last year was probably the second best power hitting college bat.
Yeah.
So big difference there. Heston Kjerstad was not really a contact guy. There were other guys ahead of him in the college ranks that were better contact hitters, with Austin Martin, Garrett Mitchell, and Nick Gonzalez, probably all being better college bats than Heston Kjerstad. Kjerstad just had the lefty power, which would play really well at Oriole Park at Camden Yards, which is probably what intrigued Mike Elias and company about him so much with that number 2 overall pick.
Yeah, so while the hit tool is much higher, the power is a little bit less, and that the difficulty with scouts is just determining how likely, not just how high is that tool and how good can it be, but how likely it is that they hit their ceiling, with any one of those tools. And the other big difference that you just mentioned right before we went to that clip of Elias is the defense. So while they're, it's unclear right now. This kid's 21 years old. We have no idea if he's going to stick in center field long term. Mike Elias seems to think he is a center fielder, and he did win his Conference Player of the Year last year, and he showed that he could be a good center fielder. But, there's a big difference between playing in the Southland Conference and playing in AA or AAA. But even if he doesn't stick in center field, the thinking is he will be, at least right now, just based on his tools, he's a better defensive outfielder than Heston Kjerstad was.
Definitely. And if you need to stick him in a corner outfield, it's a lot better to stick a center fielder in a corner outfielder than just trying to make a corner outfielder work. And if you need an example of that, look at Austin Hayes and Ryan McKenna at the major league level right now. Two guys that are perfectly capable of playing center field, but Cedric Mullins is obviously locking down that spot right now. And both Hayes and McKenna, having shifted over to a corner outfield spot, are playing elite corner outfield defense because they're good enough to play in center, but now you just put them in the corner because you have Cedric Mullins in center.
Yeah, Cowser and Kjerstad are just different molds of outfielders. And
right.
if Colton Cowser is a corner outfielder, they're just the two different types of corner outfielders. There's the corner outfielder that is a former center fielder and can play center field in a pinch, and there's the corner outfielder that is a power hitter that is mostly just stuck in the corner outfield because they can't play too many other positions and they already have a DH. Right. The first is probably Colton Cowser. The second is probably Heston Kjerstad.
Right. And the second, you look at Ryan Mountcastle and DJ Stewart.
And Trey Mancini a couple years ago.
Yeah, and Trey Mancini. Ideally, you don't really want them in a corner outfield, but their bat is so good that you need them in the lineup.
Right.
Colton Cowser is going to be much better defensively than those guys.
Yeah, it's just a different kind of molds.
Right.
And also, interestingly enough, we've heard Mike Elias say over the past week, called Cedric Mullins a face of the franchise type player. He's quickly becoming that. And he specifically mentioned in our interview on MASN All Access the fact that Cedric Mullins is currently in center field right now for this team. So he kind of talked about the possibility of Cedric Mullins still being in center field when Colton Cowser makes his big league debut. So he's looking a little bit longer term with Cedric Mullins.
Yeah.
That's the most that we've heard him talk about, like, long term, other than maybe Ryan Mountcastle, with a current guy who's on the roster.
Which is exciting because the Orioles, for the last few years at least, if there is a player that is performing well at the major leagues, it's just kind of a countdown to the trade deadline to see what prospects they can get for him. But Cedric Mullins, at 26 years old in center field, at least from everything we're hearing from Mike Elias so far, we've been a little surprised that he is talking about Cedric Mullins like this. We thought there wasn't a high % chance that they trade Mullins at the deadline, but the chance is always still there because he's been so good this year, and you could get an absolute haul of prospects for him if you do end up trading him. So it's a nice little surprise to hear Mike Elias talk about Cedric Mullins as a guy who is presumably going to be sticking with the franchise for the next few years.
It's a nice thought that he's imagining Cedric Mullins in center with Heston Kjerstad or Austin Hayes or Colton Cowser on the opposite sides of him in center. That's a cool way to kind of imagine the future.
Yeah.
In terms of, we talked about it earlier in the podcast, but these college performers, and Mike Elias has shown an affinity in the first round. All 3 first-round picks that he's made have been college performers, And he talked about that yesterday with the media, why he is drawn to these college performers. It seems to fit the draft models that he is following.
These elite college performers over and over are surprisingly good when you look back at past drafts, and you're amazed that they didn't go higher sometimes. And that has continued to be a lesson of history year after year. And we're very mindful of that. But I've been a part of a lot of high picks. We've taken high school hitters many times with those high picks. We've taken college hitters. It just depends. And it depends on the evaluation. And unfortunately, when you're picking high, you only get one pick because you like a lot of these guys and you have to pick one player. You can't take more than one home. So we got our guy, very pleased about that. But, there were a lot of players in this draft, and there's still a lot of players on the board that we really, really like, and we'll see where this goes next round.
These draft models have become increasingly popular among front offices, and while Mike Elias is not tipping his hand as to what he's using, what his scouts are telling him, and what people like Sig Mejdal and others in the front office, his analytics department, is telling him, we have a general sense of there is a group of people in that front office that looks at previous drafts, analyzes all the data, and says, this kind of demographic is undervalued. This kind of demographic is overvalued. And it's pretty clear to me, Brendan, that he and his front office believe that college performers is an undervalued demographic.
Well, and it's pretty clear, regardless of whether or not we know the specifics, it's clear that the Orioles are a metric-heavy team.
Yes.
They are going to look at the analytics with these college and high school players and probably going to draft based on the probability that these guys make the major leagues. Colton Cowser, like I said before, according to pretty much all of the metrics on Colton Cowser, he is a high probability major leaguer. He might not have the same ceiling that some of the other guys available at number 5 had, but the percentage chance that he makes the major leagues and is a quality starter is higher than some of the other guys that were on the board, probably most of the guys that were on the board at that spot. So if you are looking for somebody who is going to be a high probability major leaguer, Colton Cowser was the pick.
And I went back and I looked at some of the previous drafts, because you heard Elias say there, you look at previous drafts and say, this guy should have gone higher, and a lot of those guys are college performers. Go back to 2011, Anthony Rendon at 6, George Springer at 11. Both those guys, college bats that did not go in the top 5 that probably should have, definitely should have. Yeah. 2014, Kyle Schwarber at 4, Michael Conforto at 10, Trey Turner at 13. Those guys should have gone higher, all college performers. 2015, Andrew Benintendi at 7, Ian Happ at 9, and then 2016, Kyle Lewis at 11. So all guys that were taken right in that range that the Orioles were. So the hope is that they landed with Colton Cowser, another guy that in a few years we're saying, this guy was an elite college hitter at Sam Houston State. Why wasn't he being looked at as one of the better prospects of this draft? And why did we think that he was the 10th best prospect and that it was a reach for the Orioles at 5?
Yeah, I think Kyle Lewis in 2016, did he win the Golden Spikes Award that year? He might have been the best player in college baseball in 2016. And Colton Cowser was one of the best players in all of college baseball this year. Like I said before, he's probably, Kyle Lewis won the Golden Spikes Award in 2016. Colton Cowser, as I said before, probably the second best college position player in this draft behind number 1 overall pick Henry Davis. The high school players are really hard to project. You are hoping that Khalil Watson in 4 or 5 years turns into the kind of player that you're hoping he could be. You are hoping that Jordan Lawler in 4 or 5 years turns into a Carlos Correa-esque shortstop. A college bat like Colton Cowser, you're probably going to see him in Double-A Bowie next year.
Yeah, it's a safer pick in theory. And the idea is you go with a couple guys who are safer, eventually one of those guys is going to break out and might have go ahead above their ceiling. And the hope is that you have enough of those guys that you can build a solid team. Especially when it comes to the Jordan Lawler conversation, I think that they were just not willing to spend that kind of money on a guy that they considered higher risk.
Right.
The ceiling was higher for Jordan Lawler, but when you're committing a significant dollar amount to your first round pick, you're hampering yourself in the 19 rounds that follow. And so their thinking is, if we save a little money here on a guy that we think may not have quite the ceiling that Jordan Lawler does, but he has a higher floor than Jordan Lawler does. Maybe he will be a productive big leaguer. Who knows? Maybe he'll be even better than that, could be an all-star level player, and we saved ourselves a little bit of money that we can spend later on in the draft.
And it's not like Mike Elias is not going to draft a high schooler if he thinks the potential is there. He drafted Gunnar Henderson in 2019 because it made sense at that spot. And Gunnar Henderson has been fantastic so far. He's been flying up prospect rankings. So it's entirely possible that with the number 5 overall pick, Elias opts to go for a little bit of a safer option. And maybe later on in the draft, we'll see what he does with his second-round pick. Maybe there's a high schooler there that falls a little bit, and because high schoolers are so much harder to project, maybe there's somebody that the Orioles are really high on that other teams aren't, and maybe they find really good value at that spot.
Yeah, and of course, Mike Elias is not going to come out and say this guy's an underslot pick, but he was fairly candid when he spoke with the media yesterday about the fact that he could be getting a little bit of a discount here with Colton Cowser.
Well, look, whatever we end up signing him for, we'll sign him for. And obviously from the club side, you want to preserve as much capital for the rest of the draft as possible, but you take the guy that you want to take. And that's what we did here. This was our player at 5. And so that's the most important thing, I think, for our draft and the way we've approached it wherever I've been. But you do work your bonus pool in this day and age, and that's what happens. But the draft is it's always evolving. Just before I came up here, there were a couple picks that we weren't expecting. Teams have a lot of proprietary information nowadays that aren't available to the public and the media. And, it makes for differences based on what's out there. So, I'm sure there'll be more surprises later tonight, and we're going to be poised to be as aggressive as possible, signing good talent that's still on the board for the next few picks.
A good summary of the underslot strategy that Mike Elias has employed over the past couple years. And Brendan, you mentioned Gunnar Henderson, the idea that they could take a high schooler, with the second or third round pick who may sign for a little bit over slot because they save themselves some money there. And there are some guys on the board that they might be able to take with a second or third round pick maybe who are just hanging around because teams don't want to pay them the money.
Yeah, Nathan on YouTube, thanks for following along, says, we want Peyton Stovall today. I want Peyton Stovall today. I think that would be a fantastic second-round pick. He is the 29th ranked prospect according to MLB Pipeline, 18-year-old high schooler. You mentioned that only a few guys in the top 60 have a 60 hit tool like Colton Cowser does. Peyton Stovall, 18 years old, 60 hit tool.
Yeah, how many guys? Didn't you go back and look at how many guys had a 60 hit tool?
7 guys in the top 60 prospects, according to MLB Pipeline, that have a hit tool of 60. Peyton Stovall still on the board, the 29th ranked prospect that the Orioles could maybe look at with that 41st overall pick in the second round. 60 overall hit tool. He could be a really good pick. He's an infielder, just 18 years old, committed to Arkansas right now, left-handed bat. I think it would be a really good pick and probably an overslot in that second round, but the Orioles now have the flexibility because of that Colton Cowser pick.
And they have the 41st overall pick in the draft that picks back up at 1 o'clock today, and you look at the board of the guys that are left, and I don't want to go too off about the guys that are left now because this podcast will be irrelevant in 2 days. But there are, the top guys there are ranked in the top 20. And they're high school bats, probably because teams aren't as willing to hand them as much money. But now that they've fallen out of that first round and out of the competitive round A, and the Orioles have a pick in competitive balance round B, by the way, at 65. So they have a couple picks coming up pretty quickly. The thinking is maybe you can get them, pay them a little bit more than the average second round pick, but you're getting a better talent.
And I think Orioles fans, while Colton Cowser might be a little bit surprising at number 5, if the Orioles are able to get a Gunnar Henderson-esque prospect with this 41st overall pick, I think they'll be pretty happy with that.
Absolutely. All right. In terms of Colton Cowser in this farm system, where do you think in a couple days when the MLB Pipeline farm system rankings are updated, where do you think Colton Cowser is going to slot into the Orioles top 30?
I think probably number 5 or number 6. The one guy that we were talking about where we're not sure if he's going to go ahead or behind is Gunnar Henderson, who has been flying up draft boards. It's really just going to depend on how highly people think of Gunnar Henderson, because he wasn't drafted as highly as Colton Cowser was, obviously, but is he just good enough because of where he was in the draft to, regardless of that and how he's played in the minor leagues, still fly up boards? So maybe Colton Cowser is ahead of Gunnar Henderson. I think he probably is. I think he comes in at number 5.
If he is ahead of Gunnar Henderson, he will definitely be in the top 100. Gunnar Henderson is 91 in the MLB Pipeline top 100 rankings, which gives the Orioles, 5? I think they have 5 prospects in their top 100 right now. Adley Rutschman, Grayson Rodriguez, Heston Kjerstad, DL Hall, and Gunnar Henderson. So if you slot Colton Cowser into that top 100 ahead of Gunnar Henderson, he's going to be there. Although we don't know, this whole influx of new prospects is probably going to push some guys down.
There's probably a chance that Gunnar Henderson at 91 right now
might be bumped out,
pushed out of the top 100,
because we're going to see Henry Davis and all these guys be added. Jordan Lawler be added to the top 100. But yeah, in terms of the Orioles system, I think he's going to be right in that range. I think he's probably ahead of Westberg, but I think he is going to be right in that range, which is pretty solid for a number 5 overall pick. And it'll be interesting to see the other guys that they select, where these guys fit in their top 30 as well, because I was kind of surprised last year in 2020, maybe I shouldn't have been, with all the picks that in 2020 immediately slotted into the Orioles top 30.
Yeah.
And it shows that the second and third and fourth and fifth round picks are still highly touted prospects, even though just because they're not part of the first 45 or 50 that go off the board doesn't mean that they're not viewed as highly touted prospects. Jordan Westberg, who was the 30th overall pick last year, immediately slotted into the Orioles top 10, and now he's the 6th ranked prospect. Hudson Haskin, who was their second round pick, number 13 in the Orioles system right now. Carter Baumler, who was a later round pick, I believe he was their final pick in that draft, in the 5th round, is their 19th ranked prospect. So the Orioles system is going to get an influx of talent over the coming days.
Yeah, and Kobe Mayo comes in at number 14, who was their second to last pick in that draft. And you don't get Kobe Mayo unless you draft Heston Kjerstad second overall for that underslot value.
Absolutely. So while it is a similar strategy to last year, I think Colton Cowser is a different type of player. Honestly, I also think there's a difference to bring up the Kjerstad thing one more time. And look, Heston Kjerstad is going through his health concerns, and that is, we hope, the absolute best for him. And I think there is no reason whatsoever for anybody to be in a position to judge that pick now. We have no idea what Heston Kjerstad is going to be. We hope that he is going to be on the field in 2021, and if not, then 2022. But his health concerns are first and foremost, and what he ends up being, if he has more complications with his health concerns, that should not be an indictment of that number 2 overall pick. It is just a situation out of their control.
Right. And the bottom line is that if Heston Kjerstad were at AA Bowie right now, as he might have been as an established college bat, if he was hitting well in AA, none of us are talking about how Heston Kjerstad was underslotted at number 2 and how that's a risky
terrible
decision.
Strategy. Yeah.
We're talking about how Heston Kjerstad was underslotted at number 2, and not only did you get a great prospect second overall, you also got other guys later in the draft. So obviously, it's impossible to evaluate right now.
And the reason that he isn't in AA right now is because, or single A at the very least, is because of these health concerns that are out of his control. They were out of the Orioles' control. Literally nobody knew about this until he was drafted. And, it's just literally something that came up after the draft, and it was unfortunate, the timing of it. But that is the reason that he has not. It's not because, this guy was underslot and should have been taken here. It's health concerns that are out of his control.
And in fairness, the Colton Cowser strategy, while it's similar to Heston Kjerstad, it's not the same, and I don't think we should look at Colton Cowser and Heston Kjerstad as the same prospects.
Yes.
Nor should we look at the draft situations the same. Because if the Orioles last year wanted to draft the second best college bat behind number 1 overall pick Spencer Torkelson, there were probably better options on the board if they didn't want to go underslot. If they just said the plan is to get the second best college bat behind Torkelson, you had Austin Martin on the board, you had Nick Gonzalez on the board, and you had Garrett Mitchell on the board, all three of which are performing well in the minor leagues right now. Heston Kjerstad was just the second best power-hitting college bat in last year's draft, while Colton Cowser this year, as I've said before, was the second best college bat, period, in this draft. So, yes, they are kind of similar strategies, but they are definitely different picks in terms of their value and where they go.
Absolutely. So we'll see. We'll see what these guys end up becoming over the coming years. And we'll see what the Orioles do on day 2 of the draft and day 3 tomorrow. I'm excited for the home run derby tonight, Brian.
Oh, me too. Going to be a good time to watch Trey Mancini hit some dingers.
Cedric Mullins in the All-Star game tomorrow.
Hopefully a starter.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. That just about does it for our podcast, which, of course, you can watch on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. If you don't do so already, you can listen to it on Spotify, SoundCloud, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts. Anywhere you get your podcasts, you can catch the MASN All Access Podcast. And today's episode, our draft recap, is brought to you by Royal Farms Real Fresh, Real Fast. He is Brendan Mortensen, at Brendan Morty on Twitter. I'm at Paul Mancano. Thanks to Bobby Blanco for running the show today. We will be back in a week's time to discuss the All-Star break, All-Star game, Home Run Derby, and the return of baseball in the second half of the 2021 season. Thanks so much for tuning in.